You have no idea the lengths they would go to survive, and just what they'd do to take you with them. Mounted Ambassador to the Lanark Talon, 12 TXE. Mass critical. Mass at 0.001%. Refueling interrupted. Systems check. OK. Pilot check. Pilot not found. Available crew. 0. Automated systems check. OK. Ammunition. 12%. Warning. Mass critical. Checking targeting criteria. Passed. Launching. The fog pushed in from all sides. A pale yellowish white, with a glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere that made the fog blinding. Visibility was terrible, a handful of meters at best. Sounds echoed and were warped. Here a light clinking could be heard 3 blocks from the source. There a scream could not be heard at 10 paces. The oncoming door pushed the group into the fog, even though the HFY Fulton soldier tried to hold it back. Her strength was no match for pistons and gears, and she stumbled forward, grabbed by the HFY Fulton scientist. "Thank you," she said, straightening up. They looked around, listening closely. The two HFY Fulton and the Strevical lifted their faces slightly and sniffed the air. The rodent-like long noses of the HFY Fulton moved slightly back and forth, their whiskers trembling. The two Strevical were long-limbed, 4 eyes at the front of a flat face with a ridged forehead. Their noses were flat and wide, 3 nostrils, and they sniffed delicately at the fog. The Dremkillia sniffed too, its wide, expressive eyes on either side of a long nose looking around. "No smell," the Dremkillia said. "I smell rotted meat, faintly," the Strevical scientist said. It sniffed again. "Burnt metal. Burning wood." The soldier quit sniffing. "I smell death," it said in a flat voice. The two HFY Fulton moved around, sniffing carefully. "The fog has a faint smell. Sulfuric compounds maybe," the scientist said. "Oxidizing metal. Rotting cellulose. Burnt plastic. Burnt alloys. Rotting foot. Meat and vegetables." "Not sure," the HFY Fulton soldier said, moving around slowly. "This doesn't feel right." Unvarak nodded, not bothering. His people weren't known for their sense of smell. The Dremkillia moved next to him, and Unvarak reflexively patted the shorter being on the top of the head, getting a wide smile full of flat herbivore teeth that stretched from one side of the face to the other. The Dremkillia's forehead was sloped backwards slightly, hidden beneath the swirling grey, white, and black short fur that covered his body. "We should get moving," the HFY Fulton soldier said, looking around. "Blasted fog." "And go where?" the Strevical soldier asked. He hung his head, staring at the ground, blinking slowly. "There is nowhere to go. It said survive. We should survive. I would like to survive," the Dremkillia said. It smiled again. "We are together. We are not trapped in a cave-in. We can survive. By the Ancient Ones, I wish I was so simple," the Strevical soldier muttered almost too low to hear. He looked up. "I guess we should get moving." Leading the way, Unvarak looked around carefully as he and the others moved slowly through the fog. The first thing they found was a burned-out ground effect vehicle, a wheeled transport of some type that was twisted and burnt, some of the endosteel structure oxidized. A skeleton was trapped inside, the metal warped, half-melted, and twisted around the bleached white bone. A complex electronic system was embedded in the skull, the hair-thin wires normally in the cerebral tissue hanging loose in the skull. A scream from behind him made Unvarak jump and turned around, to see nothing but the swirling, drifting yellow fog. They all looked at the vehicle, moving around it. The Strevical jumped onto the burnt and twisted frame, moving up to the skeletal remains, and started tugging on the electronic embedded in the white bone of the skull. Brain implant. It squeaked, tugging harder. The Strevical took 2 steps, grabbed the scientist by the back of the coveralls, and yanked them off, twisting at the waist and throwing the smaller Strevical nearly 5 feet. "Do not touch Terra dead," the soldier snarled. "I wish to examine the remains and the electronics for science," the scientist squealed from the supine position. Uvnarak could hear the stress, the almost religious bend, to the word science, and saw the soldier's eyes go flat and cold. "Do not touch," the soldier warned. It leaned down into the scientist's face. "Do not touch." The scientist swallowed thickly and nodded, kicking its legs to move backwards, to put some distance between it and the Strevical soldier. "We should keep moving," Unvarak said. He looked at the Strevical scientist. "Try to keep your instincts in check." The Strevical curled its lip in contempt, but said nothing as it got to its feet. The group moved on, passing more burnt-out and twisted wreckage, all of it with 1 or more skeletons inside. It was hard to keep track of time in the fog. There was no sense of the passage of time, no landmark to track progress, no sun or moon to see moving across the sky. There was just the swirling fog, the patches of softly glowing luminescence, and the wreckage. The wreckage got thicker. 3 rows of blasted and damaged vehicles, disappearing into the fog within 3 or 4 steps. Walking to one side or the other of the middle line, the far line was only visible as shadows in the mist. All of the wreckage had skeletal remains. Twice the soldier grabbed the Strevical scientist and yanked him off the wreckage, throwing him to the Ferrocrete roadway. The road split, moving right and down as well as moving forward. After a few moments of hushed discussion, the group slowly moved down the road to the right. The roadway was clear, although it bore mute evidence of explosions and fire. The Ferrocrete was cracked here and there, with thin stalks of dead weeds marking the deeper cracks. There were black stains where something burned. At the bottom was a huge pile of burnt wreckage. All types of wheeled and hover vehicles, all tangled together, with white gleaming bone visible in the wreckage. The Ferrocrete around the pile was slagged, pitted, and cracked, with yellowish dead weeds, tall and thin, having pushed through the cracks. "There," the Strevical soldier said, pointing at the right-hand corner. Only a half-dozen vehicles were crumpled together, but there were no other wrecks piled on top. Screams in the distance answered his single word. The group carefully climbed over the wreckage, avoiding the skeletal remains. The Fulton soldier grabbed the Strevical scientist, ignoring its protests, and pulled him through the wreckage without allowing him to examine the dead. "This way is as good as any," the DRA Fulton soldier said, pointing. There was no argument, the fog seeming to make speech unwanted or unnecessary, and the group moved in that direction, following the DRA Fulton way of the Means trooper as she led the group, with Unvarak following a close second. The Strevical soldier walked behind the Strevical scientist, shoving him occasionally to keep him moving forward instead of darting forward to check wreckage that appeared out of the fog. They climbed rubble, ferrocrete, twisted endosteel beams and battlesteel struts, stopping twice to rest. They moved forward, and suddenly the DRA Fulton soldier stopped. The remains of buildings loomed out of the mist. Massive skeletal edifices that soared up into the fog, which seemed to cling and adhere to the girders of the building in a way that Unvarak felt was almost greasy. "How far up do you think it goes?" the DRA Fulton soldier asked, looking up. Unvarak could only see 2 sets of girders parallel to the ground. "Who knows?" the Strevical soldier said. He knelt down, his left hock and left knee popping, and touched the ferrocrete. It burned and was blasted again and burned again. He looked up. "These buildings were bombed." "How do you know?" the Strevical scientist sneered. "There is not enough evidence to make such conclusions." "I've seen bombed-out buildings before," the Strevical soldier said, "on more than one world." The scientist huffed and turned away, its wide leaf-shaped ears reddening in embarrassment. "We should keep moving," the Way of the Means soldier said. "The rubble is very solid," Unverak said. "Packed tightly. Cracks filled." He knelt down. "Moss of some sort is here and there on the ferrocrete." He picked up a small pebble and squeezed it. It crushed into powder and floated down. "It's decayed. Ferrocrete does not decay quickly. We need to move," the Way of the Means soldier said again. She lifted her snout and sniffed again. "Now, what is there? Eep." The Strevikaus scientist started to say right before the soldier grabbed him and yanked him along. Unverak moved up to right behind the soldier, crossing the debris field. It was eerie, looking up and seeing the hyperalloy bones of the Skyraker above them, vanishing into the pale yellow fog, and looking down to see grey aging ferrocrete with shards of macroplas embedded in it. The debris went down, then up, and the group kept moving, pausing for breaks. It never got colder, just a slight sticky warmth that made the sweat feel greasy and clingy. It never got warmer, just a slight chill that settled into the exposed joints. It never got darker, the illumination all around them but coming from nowhere. It never got lighter, shadows and darkness looming out of the fog only to fade away. Even Unverak could faintly smell the faint odor of something decomposing, of scorched metal, of burnt meat. It would drift in with the fog, then be gone when he tried to concentrate on it. After coming down off of one pile of rubble that had contained jagged chunks of mirrored macroplas larger than Unverak, the group found themselves walking on a roadway instead of more rubble. The roadway was hidden by a thick layer of compacted and solidified grey dust that cracked and broke beneath their feet. Unverak bent down, brushing the dust aside, and looked closely. It was definitely a street. A faint flickering of multiple blue and red lights could be seen up ahead, and the group rushed toward it. Heavy armored vehicles were across the street, the lights dimly shining in the fog, blocking off the street. The windows were white, the macroplas crazed and milky. The paint was damaged, cracked and pitted, the logos and stickers peeled off and hanging in strips. There were skeletal remains around the vehicles, inside the front of the vehicles. The Way of the Means soldier bent down and picked up a weapon. "Fallen Confederacy magnetic accelerator rifle," she said. She hefted it. "Flat charge," she ejected the magazine, which had a round ball as big as Unverak's fist at one end. She glanced inside the magazine. "Mag's empty." She slapped it back in. She looked it over. "Scope lenses are covered with dust and pitted." She dropped it on the ground. "Useless. We should keep moving," the Strevikaus soldier said. He pointed to the side. "There. I saw something different for just a moment over there." The group moved forward, and faint lights could be seen in the direction they were heading. They all jumped when loud sirens kicked on, echoing through the streets, the tone and volume rising and falling, coming from countless sources. "Incoming attack detected. Mass critical. Mass at 0.00012%. No fuel reserves available. Systems check. OK. Pilot check. Sasa failure. Crew check. Failure. Available crew reserves. 0. Automated systems check. OK. Ammunition. 22.5%. Warning. Incoming attack. Launching. Run. The Strevikaus soldier yelled. Unverak burst into a sprint, feeling his age and lack of physical fitness immediately. He was still not the slowest, and he slowed down and reached out to grab the Dremkilia by the biceps, pulling the smaller being along. Shops loomed out of the mist, shutters over the windows and doors. One doorway was open, and the Strevikaus soldier led the way inside. Unverak was last, and the Strevikaus soldier slammed the door shut. The room was full of table and bench seats, a counter on the left with obvious cooking surfaces, The sign above the cooking surfaces was unreadable, faded with age. Skeletons were all over the floor, on the benches, under the tables. The sirens were still wailing, but the sound muted slightly. "What do you think?" Unverak started to ask. Loud explosions started, the tearing sound of close-together explosions, and the scream of gravlifter engines filled the air. Dust fell from the ceiling at several of the louder explosions. "We're being bombed," the Strevikal soldier said. "Are you sure?" the Way of the Means soldier asked. "I've been bombed before." "Haven't you?" the Strevikal asked. "Way of the Means do not fight on the battlefield. That is the duty of the means to the ends," the Dra. Fulton said. There was a brightening of the fog, to where it almost hurt. For a second the fog was crushed against the thick macroplas windows that were protected by heavy transparent shutters. There was a rumble that threw everyone off of their feet and made objects inside the building's room they clatter and rattle as they jumped around. Some fell to the floor and shattered. Then the fog dissolved, and for a second they could see the street beyond. It was covered with dust that covered vehicles, destroyed benches and other objects, and thousands of skeletons of terrors. The fog suddenly rushed back. "An atomic," the Strevikal said quietly from where he had rolled under a table, scattering the bones of skeletons. "We must have been at the edge. Who's bombing us? Who's bombing this place? It's dead." "There's nothing here," the Strevikal scientist squealed. "No use in bombing this place. No use in bombing just the 6 of us." "Because someone has decided it's a target," the Strevikal soldier stated, his voice flat and dead again. The Dra. Fulton soldier looked around. "They were packed in here when they died." She looked at the Strevikal scientist, who had picked up a skull and was looking at the hair-thin wires inside. "Stop that." The Strevikal soldier smacked it out of his hand. "Don't touch." The Dremkilia looked at Unverak. "We are still alive," he smiled. Unverak nodded. "Fuel critical. Severe frame damage. Alerting pilot. Error. Searching for suitable landing area. Done. Initiating landing." The group slowly got up, looking around. "What do you think killed them?" the Dra. Fulton scientist asked, kneeling down and looking over the skeletons without touching them as much as possible. "They are all tangled up. Whatever it was fast. It didn't tear apart the bodies. It didn't leave any obvious injuries," Unverak said. The howl of grav engines, badly out of tune, sounded from the street with the appearance of light that lanced down out of the sky, only to be swallowed by the fog. "A vehicle," the Dra. Fulton scientist said, moving to the window. Unverak moved up next to him. A long-nosed vehicle set down, bobbing for a moment before settling down. Even through the window Unverak could hear the crunch of bone as it crushed some of the skeletons out in the street. The lights flashed several times, then stopped. Only a dim red glow from the further away part visible. "We should see who is in it. See if they can help us," the Dra. Fulton soldier said quietly. The Strevikal soldier nodded. "We be careful." The group pulled open the door, ignoring that it pushed skeletal remains that had shifted in the blast, and moved into the street in a bunch. They approached the dim shadow of the vehicle slowly, jostling against one another. The fog finally allowed the group to see the vehicle. It was long-nosed, short wings, wheeled landing gear, graviton engines on the wings. It was all black, with faded stencils on it that could no longer be made out. The armor was pitted, cracked, and showed signs of repair. The cockpit canopy was cracked and glazed white. Unverak climbed up with the Strevikal soldier, scrambling at one point. The armor was some kind of material, 19 variant. The Strevikal soldier looked around the edge of the canopy for a minute before twisting a bolt and pulling it back. The cockpit raised up, revealing a single occupant. They wore an armored flight suit with a helmet, the visor of the helmet clear. "Well, who are they?" the Dire Fulton soldier asked. "It doesn't matter," the Strevical soldier said. "Why?" the Dire Fulton soldier asked. The face shield and the armor had holes in it. The skull inside the helmet grinned at Unvarak with fleshless glee. "He's dead,"